I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for the webinar topic, which is SIPOC diagrams. A couple of housekeeping items just before we get into this is we ask that during the webinar that everybody please mute their phones just so that stops any background noise from coming through and distracting either the facilitator or other people on the webinar. So that would be appreciated. For those of you that are not as familiar with EZSigma, we have been around since 2000. We were actually the first Canadian company to offer Lean Six Sigma certification, which we're quite proud of. I know some of you have gone through that entire process with us. Others are still considering, but it does include both training, an exam, and a project submission. So it's a great way to show your employer and just to show the world that you've actually got that tangible experience in running and completing a successful Lean or Six Sigma project. EZSigma, though, is very passionate about continuous improvement. You can see on the screen here our vision and mission, and so we're very pleased to be able to offer this free webinar series this year. So far, we've had some great feedback, so we're hoping to be able to continue this and make it a regular offering in the years to come. So if you do have any feedback or suggestions for future topics, definitely feel free to pass those on. The webinar today is being facilitated by Jeff Woods. He is one of our top facilitators. For those of you that have engaged with us, chances are you've had him in the classroom. He does a lot of our coaching, project mentoring, also our training for both the open enrollment program and for on-site training. You can see here just a few notes about Jeff. He's got a wealth of experience and he's worked in all industries across the board. So the tools and concepts that he is teaching, he's able to relate to every industry that you can imagine, which is a huge asset. Both to EZSigma and to our clients and anyone that has the pleasure of sitting in a classroom with him. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff Woods. And again, please do be sure to mute your phones just for background noise. We will have an opportunity following this webinar to ask some questions. And as always, you're more than welcome to email us or call us directly. So Jeff, the floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you, Liz. And as always, thank you for the glowing comments coming into it. Appreciate it. Today's topic is SIPOC, Supplier, Input, Process, Output, Customer. And if for those that were in the class last month or in the webinar last month, you would have recognized that we used the SIPOC a little bit as our precursor to the value stream mapping conversation. And the SIPOC is a tool that has a lot of flexibility and variability and a lot of different use that you can use across the business. And so we'll talk about a number of those ways of applying it throughout this. But I want to start by kind of looking at, the SIPOC. And just as we had a precursor to the value stream map, as I say, which was the SIPOC, there's a precursor often to the SIPOC when we look at it. And that's because often when we have an issue, if there's a problem at work, we start with our problem statement and thinking about what the problem is I'm trying to solve. For those that have attended our courses, you'll be familiar with this picture and looking and trying to understand what's the problem this gentleman is trying to solve. Is it stopping the eggs from being cracked, or is it improving the Band-Aid process for when we do the rework? And so, when we think about problems at work, it really begins with what's the issue that we're experiencing and what's the real problem that I'm trying to solve. And then once we look at that, then the next question is, well, if I have this issue, what process does that issue reside within? And so we want to think about, well, where in what process are we having those challenges? And that's where the journey begins. And often it's the sponsor or the person that's looking at having the project speaking with their with their sponsor or their champion around the issue. And so with the champion and the owner or sponsor, you're looking at, well, what are the issues we're having? What's the problem we're having? What process within our control are we having this issue with? And when we want to look at, well, what's the scope of what we want to look at? The tool that we use is the SIPOC, because when we're looking at that beginning of a project, we really want to understand, well, what's the current state? If we have an issue, as we've gone through the problem statement, we've understood, well, what's the gap between how well that process is performing versus how well it's supposed to perform? And we'll talk a little bit about the critical two, so which metric is not performing, or metrics are not performing when we look at it. So we start by trying to understand that current state, and that begins with looking at the SIPOC, supplier, input, process, output, customer, because that SIPOC, when we use it in this context, really helps us quickly shape the scope of what we're looking at. You know, where does it begin? Where does it end? And it also looks at understanding the suppliers and customers, who's involved in the process. So if we're going to look at it, who needs to be in the room? And it really lets us kind of get that initial focus. So again, often the process owner or the person who's discovering it and the champion are talking about it. They're working through what's the problem they're trying to solve, what's the SIPOC, who needs to be in the room, and that really lets us move towards where we want to go next. Because we need to understand who needs to be in the room if we're going to actually look at discovering and working through a problem. So what is this HiPOC? High-level process map that identifies the customer, so who receives the output, and that customer as it is at each stage along the way of the process. So you've got the final external customer, or the process could into another final internal customer, but you have all the internal customers throughout the process who are receiving things, and then they become a supplier to the next step in the process. So you've got the customers and the suppliers, you've got the outputs. What are the outputs that they're creating that then goes to the next step in the process, or ultimately to the end customer? So what are those process steps that we're going through? Process, what inputs are required at each level of the process as we go through, and who supplies it. So really, it's a high-level snapshot that lets us really understand and see what the key components of the process are, where does it begin, where does it end, so I understand the scope of what I'm looking at, who are the suppliers and customers, so I know who to have in the room, and get a first gauge of, depending what you're using it for, understanding the critical twos around what does success look like? What are we actually trying to do at each level of the process? One of the key concepts that I just referred to is the critical twos. So when we look at a process, what are the characteristics that mean success at each level of the process and for the overall process? This can become important particularly when we're building new processes. So if we're designing new processes, the SIPOC can be a great tool to help us understand at each level, well, what are the attributes that process should be? It could be something around ease of access, how quick we can use it, the speed of creation, the accuracy required. So when we think of the critical to tree, we think about critical to satisfaction overall, which is made up by critical to quality, critical to delivery or cycle time, critical to cost, and then a fourth one, critical to human or health, safety, regulatory, environmental. So the other things that we could be tracking. And really that sort of lets us understand going into it, what are the critical twos of the process that flow into that. So that helps us really try to understand what we're trying to achieve. And again, often when we're starting a project, we're going, well, why are we looking at this? Is it critical to quality where we have more defects or more rework than we should be having? We're at 40% defects or rework and we should be at 20%, or is it critical to delivery where it's taking us 2 days to do the work and we should be able to do it in 1 day, whatever that looks like, critical to cost or critical to regulatory, whatever the issue is that we're having. So we want to sort of define that moving forward. When do we use it? Again, often, and I'm using the word often because there's lots of different ways of using a SIPOC, and we'll talk about a few of those later on today. But often it's early in that define stage. As I say, when you get together with your champion, you're looking at what's the problem I'm having, what processes that exist within, and then I really want to create quickly that SIPOC, which defines who the people are that need to be in the room when we're working on it. So ensure construction of an accurate and complete charter. It can help us build that charter, information we need around project team, issue, metrics. Identify the customers as well as suppliers, who are the key stakeholders. Not only do I want to have the people in the room who work on the process, but I want to also think about who's that key supplier that started the process. So what was that key trigger that started it? And making sure that I have access to, or them in the room to understand, what are they giving us? Why are they giving us that way? Is there ways that we could be changing that? And our end customer of the process, to make sure that we understand what their requirements are, what they're using, and what options we have for change. Because we don't want to necessarily change a process that impacts our supplier or customer in a negative fashion. So we want to understand what their views are on it, and we can't do that unless we know who they are. So it really helps us define the scope and the boundaries of the project and illustrate the process relationships between those suppliers and departments. And again, we use this often to get our project going, and the next step in that project is we get everybody in the room. We start to say, okay, let's map the process. Let's understand what's going on. But by having that SIPOC, we can really focus on what we need to do. And we talked about that in the last session around that value stream mapping, where that SIPOC can set us up for success. We're in the room. We know why we're there. We know where we're starting, where we're ending. We have an understanding of the high-level steps, and then we can start to really work on that value stream map. So that SIPOC is I find is a really helpful tool. Often one of the things I'll get asked, and I'll talk about coming down a little bit later when we're creating it, talking about level of detail and what I need to include in it. And really what's important is to always step back, as with any tool, and think about, what's the purpose? What am I trying to learn by using this tool? And then you make sure you use it to the degree that is required to help you answer the questions that you're trying to find. And then will go on to another tool. But think about, you're not doing it just because, well, someone said to do a SIPOC, or someone said to do a value stream map, or someone said to do a cause and effect diagram. Or whatever tool you're using, think about, well, why am I using it? What am I trying to learn? How is this what outputs, what decisions is this going to help me make to go to the next step in my project? Conceptual view of a SIPOC. Again, we have our, thinking about it down the middle, where we have our process, and really starting with what's the start of the process, the input, what's the trigger that comes in that starts the process. And an easy way to think about that is, if it's your accounts payable, the trigger is an invoice comes in, and who supplies it is the vendor. And then potentially, depending on how far you're going down, the final step is, a payment created, and the customer is that initial vendor getting their payment to them, or wherever you're stopping the process. When you create them, what's nice is if you have things layered out, and at the bottom you create that visual flow chart of the steps in the process. Really nice from a visual way of kind of snapshot of understanding what it is you're looking at. So how do we construct it? Again, there's lots of different ways, but the purpose is really to understand what's going on in that part of the process that we're going to be looking at. And so I often start with, what's the beginning and the end process steps? So when does the process start, and where does it end? And that gives me the scope of what I'm looking at. And then I'll fill in the kind of high-level steps in the middle. But with that first step, I want to understand, well, what's the trigger that started that process? So what was that input into the process that led to the kicking off of this process? And then who were the suppliers? Who supplied that input? And at the bottom, when I'm looking at that final output, I'm thinking, okay, at that final stage, what's the key output of this process? What's the purpose of this process? And who's the customer of that process or customers? And really that gives me that kind of Z look through the process as I go from top down the middle and to the bottom. And then I start to fill in all the other pieces as I go along. You know, what are at each step in the process, what are the outputs and who are the customers of it? And then on the other side, and that customer becomes a supplier into the next step in the process. What inputs go into that next step? What are the outputs? Who are the customers? And so you can kind of layer all down. And again, at the end of it, you've got a quick snapshot of what the process is, who's involved, what are some of the materials, systems that are used, and then you can move on with more discovery. One thing, again, that I'll talk about a little bit later are some other uses of using that SIPOC. And as you can see in the bottom right, with the Goldilocks rule, just the right amount of detail, not too detailed. So often in that SIPOC, you know, it's maybe somewhere between 5 and 8 steps. Doesn't mean that 4 is wrong or 9 is wrong, but you're kind of just looking at the main chunks of activity, not the minutia of the detail as it flows through. And then this becomes, you validate the map because this becomes your input into your value stream mapping session or whatever your next step in the process is. But it's a really good launching pad for make sure that you've thought about all of those initial details that you need to be thinking about before you take action in trying to fix or examine a process. A couple of examples. Again, here we have process of invoicing where we've got the key steps in the process, identify the customer to be invoiced, check the contract, you know, write the invoice, print the invoice, post the invoice. And then, you know, what are the inputs and suppliers, outputs and customers. In this one, it's just a straight laundry list, and often you see it this way because you may have redundancy around who all the suppliers are and inputs. Sometimes you'll see it line by line, where you've got the specific suppliers inputs to that step in the process, the specific outputs of that process, and the specific customer of that process. So you're kind of different ways that you can put it together depending on what you're trying to learn and what works for you. Another example, inbound call process. Again, what are the key steps in the process? What are the inputs in supplier, output, and customers? Now, as I mentioned before, they can come in a lot of different variety of forms. So another example, in this case, what they've done is we have on the right-hand side for the outputs, we have it broken down by the critical twos. So you may want to be thinking about, well, what are the characteristics that are important to those particular outputs? And really helpful example if you are designing new processes and you want to think about what do we need to be achieving at each step because it's going to be new. Those critical twos can be a great addition to your SIPOC to give you an extra level of clarity and detail that helps you move forward with the building of the process. You can also use it when examining a current one. I often see it, again, more in design. Recall that the SIPOC is a great stepping block to creating that value stream map. Doesn't mean that it's going to be a one-to-one relationship, but often what I'll do is, because we've created the SIPOC, we know who to have in the room. We have the right group of people in the room. We'll have the brown paper up on the wall, and I'll have the SIPOC on the wall also, and then I'll have pulled those key process steps and spread them across the brown paper so that we can see where does it start, where does it end, what are those key steps, and then that gives us a great place to start to fill in what are the additional steps that we want to be talking about, and then what happens at each of those steps as we go through a value stream mapping exercise. So that works really well as you're putting that all together. And in my opinion, that SIPOC is a really required tool to be using whenever you're working on a project. Again, it doesn't have to take long to do, but it can be a quick step that really can save you a lot of time down the road as you work through the project. There's lots of different ways that we can use a SIPOC. Often we use it, again, for that in that define stage where we're trying to really understand it. I've seen a number of other pieces put towards it, and then people taking that output and then using it with teams to get additional information. And one of them here is that they'll add to the side of the SIPOC the actual 8 lenses or the 8 wastes. And so they'll have that, so at each step in the process, so envision that SIPOC where we have the different steps along the bottom. If that was in a vertical row, you have another column that's going on the right-hand side here that's listing out the different ways. So at each step in the process is you have the team together. You can be, you may be having a brainstorming session, say, okay, so at this step in the process, is there any weighting, any excess transport or handling, any useless motion, any defective units? So you can quickly kind of have people thinking about that step in the process and then put any kind of description. So it's a nice add-on to the SIPOC tool that it gives you another way of using it to identify pain points. Again, what you're trying to do is get information and understanding from people in the simplest form possible. So if moving off the SIPOC helps and adding this piece to it rather than a full-blown value stream mapping session, then it's a great opportunity. I've also seen it where they'll add 2 columns called IO, issue and opportunity. So again, rather than the 8 lenses, they'll just talk about, well, what are the problems? What are the issues that are happening at this step in the process? And what are some potential opportunities for how we could look at improving those? And so you can use it again as a brainstorming tool to help you go along. And I've found that works really helpful. Another way I've seen it used is in an environmental scan, because the SIPOC again is a quick way to gather a bunch of information about a process. And I had a really interesting situation that I went through personally, where I was working with a client, and they were a growing organization that was that everything was changing fast-paced. And then one day the CFO said, "Oh, by the way, I'm leaving, and I'll be gone in 2 weeks." And at that point, because they had gone through so much change, all of their processes and all previous documentation, how things worked, really didn't apply anymore. So they went, wow, we have no idea what they do. And it was a financial organization, so lots of money flow and lots of things they really need to understand what the person did. And so we had to think about, well, what are we going to do? And so what we did is we started by creating a tier 1 process listing. In other words, at a tier 1, I wanted to know what's every process that you do as the CFO. So what are all the things that you're involved with? And so we created that list of processes and sub-processes, and then created a table that we filled in to learn more information about it. Was this a daily process? When did it happen in the month? Who was responsible for it? Who was the backup? And if we were going to change that, what would it look like? Policy required? Was it written? Do we have a documented process? And as we learned more things, we kind of captured some other information around effort, et cetera. So this gave us reasonably quickly, that list of the 30 things that we needed to know in a hurry. And then what we did is we took those 30 things and we took it down a step to the tier 2. So we looked at each process, and this is an example of a sub-process month-end invoicing, and we created the SIPOC for it. And so we were also capturing not only who was involved, but when did it happen? So workday 2 in the month, closing out at workday 4 type of thing. So we created a quick SIPOC so we knew what had to be done, who did it, what the outputs of each step in the process as it moved through the organization were, and then a quick flow chart at the bottom of each one. And what it allowed us to do in that 2 weeks is to get a real environmental scan across that whole organization of all their processes, which, you know, without using this kind of approach, we probably would never have been able to do. But it gave us a really good schematic and binder. So when that new CFO arrived, when she came in, she had this to start with. And rather than, I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I don't know what happens, and trying to get everybody in the room and try to ask those questions. So again, the purpose of bringing this example in is just to say that as with a whole bunch of the tools in the Lean toolkit, they have lots of applicability. We can use them in our projects, but we can also just grab them out and use them as we have a concern or a circumstance or a need at work. Just like, you know, a problem might pop up and go, hey, well, let's do a quick cause and effect exercise, etc. So hopefully what I was trying to go through and talk about today were not only the SIPOC and the sort of standard use of it and how we complete it, but also to step back and think about, well, since we have this tool, how else can we use it? What other kind of business circumstances come up where it could be of value? So there's lots of different ways that we can morph the tool, again, by adding columns, adding different things into our brainstorming and discussion groups, or using it for different types of issues or problems or opportunities to learn and gather information in the business. And I mentioned before that one other thing that it's a great one for if you're developing new processes. Again, that SIPOC, when we look at each step or each process, these are a great tool. And then these can also lead nicely into FMEAs, where you can take a look at each step in the process and then translated that across into a failure mode and effects analysis to do a quick environmental look at what our risks are, right? So thinking about and creating that risk analysis. So lots of different ways that you can grab a couple different tools and use them to help us solve our daily business problems. So that's our walkthrough and looking at the SIPOC. Again, interestingly enough, you see how the SIPOC helped us last month when we talked about value stream mapping, coming back to the SIPOC again today, looking how upstream from that you have what's the problem I'm trying to solve. And again, that problem can say, hey, I have this issue. How can the SIPOC help us get to the answers that we need to help us move forward within the business? And that's really what all these tools are here to help us with. Again, sort of that summary thing, whenever we think of in continuous improvement, it's really around, you know, the three questions you need to ask. You know, what do I need to ask? When do I need to ask it? And what am I going to do with the answer? And that can lead us to one of these tools. I'm going to pause for a moment. And again, as usual, if anyone has any questions, I'll pause for a couple of minutes. Please put your phone off mute and ask away. Again, it's not a speak now or forever hold your peace. Everyone knows how to get a hold of us. You can email myself or email Liz. If you ever have any questions or comments or anything going forward around process, we are always here to help and engage. So please do that. But I'll pause now for a minute just to see if anyone has any questions. And if not, then we'll kind of move forward.
I have a question, Jeff. Would you ever use a SIPOC to take a full bird's eye view of an entire department, or would it be better for smaller aspects within a department?
Well, it can be large or small, because you might be looking at you could be doing an environmental scan across the whole business from beginning to end, and you'd still start with a high-level SIPOC. The department, what you're looking at is, within the department, what process are you looking at, though? It's not like what does my department do? I mean, the departments often map out have different processes, and you would probably build a SIPOC per department, not per what does the department in itself do. But again, it would depend on kind of how it's structured.
All right.
And I did see that there was another question that came up. However, because I'm presenting, I don't see the question. So Liz, did you see if someone else had a question just now?
Using the SIPOC alone, can you use it to identify any risks?
Yes, you can. As in, when you've broken down the processes, you can have that conversation. Again, just as I said, you can lead. I would take the SIPOC steps and I would layer that into a failure mode and effects analysis, which really is asking, what can go wrong? If that goes wrong, what's the seriousness of it? What's the occurrence, or how often does that problem happen? And what's the detection that we have to actually catch that error or that issue either in station or before it gets to the customer? So trying to understand what our detection is. So absolutely, you could, in effect, hang off the right-hand side of your SIPOC. You could hang off the FMEA severity, what is it, severity, frequency, and detection coding. But I would probably just translate it on and move it over to an FMEA. But you can use it to have that conversation. And what's nice is, the kind of people and what's going on, because that you've got that kind of high-level step, and that can lead you to say, "Ooh, we better go and look deeper into this particular step in the process because it looks like there's either uncertainty or absolute risk that's going on." So hopefully that answered the question. If it didn't, ask away again. You're welcome. Okay, fantastic. So that brings to the end. I'm going to put it back over to you, Liz. But I appreciate everybody who was around and could sign up for and attend today's session. I think these have been really interesting. They've been great to put together, and I've appreciated the opportunity to reach out and speak to so many people over the last number of months.
Thank you, Jeff. So for those of you that may be interested in diving a little bit deeper, finding out some more information about not only SIPOC, but just different tools within the Lean and Six Sigma toolbox, we do offer open enrollment training. We've got some courses getting started. The in-class training begins in October. There's always opportunities for us to come on site and work with a group of people at your facility. There's also e-learning, which is self-paced programs. You can, anywhere in the world that you've got internet access, they are available. And then, of course, coaching and consulting services. So if any of those are of interest, please feel free to reach out to us anytime. You can either email me directly, or you can email info@EZSigmaGroup.com, and you're always welcome to visit our website. And as Jeff mentioned, if you've got any interest in continuing and finishing the webinar series for this year, there are 4 more webinars coming up. Next month, we're discussing spaghetti diagrams. So if you haven't signed up for the full series, definitely let us know. We would be happy to have you join us. And if you have any friends or colleagues that you think may benefit from these webinars, you're more than welcome to pass on the invitation as well. So as Jeff mentioned, if there's any further questions, definitely feel free to speak here on the webinar or reach out to us privately. We are pleased to be able to present this information to you, and just like Jeff said, have a time to reconnect with some clients and meet some new people. So we will leave the line open for another couple of minutes. And if we don't hear from anyone, have a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of the summer. All right, so thank you, everyone. There's no more questions that have come up, so we will close the session for today. And as mentioned, you're always welcome to reach out to us by phone or email. So have a great day, and we hope to see you next month. Thank you.